period in your career in Hollywood when you were to the forefront of the people who were blacklisting the alleged communist members of.
Well, that's not a true statement.
Well,
John Wayne weaponized the American frontier to establish a hegemony of stoic heroism, yet the architecture of his legend rested upon a fundamental anomaly of missing military service. The Duke consumed the national imagination to manufacture a payoff of hyper-masculinity that masked a systemic insecurity rooted in a shattered childhood identity. Was this cinematic titan a genuine cultural pillar, or was he merely a mirage designed to obscure the reality of a man perpetually fleeing his own name? What happens when the man who symbolizes the soul of a nation is himself a carefully constructed fiction, and how did the women in his life navigate the turbulence of his manufactured reality? The architecture of the American hero did not begin with a rugged cowboy on a horse. It began with a boy named Marion Morrison in the biting winds of Winterset, Iowa in 1907. The zero point of the Wayne mythos is a fracture in identity that most biographers overlook, a fundamental insecurity rooted in the domestic friction of his earliest years. His mother, Mary Alberta Brown, reportedly exhibited a systemic preference for his younger brother, Robert, even going so far as to change Marion's middle name from Robert to Michael to curry favor with a moneyed relative. This manipulation of his very name served as the initial catalyst for a lifelong search for an authoritative self. When the family migrated to the harsh, dusty climate of Palmdale and later Glendale, California, the young Marion was frequently teased for his feminine name, a social trauma that his daughter, Issa Wayne, suggests created a perpetual, systemic need for external validation and the eventual construction of the Duke persona. The transition from Marion to the Duke was not an artistic choice but a survival mechanism. The nickname was actually borrowed from his Airedale dog, a canine companion that accompanied him on his paper route through the streets of Glendale. This early adoption of a proxy identity highlights the mirage that would define his later life. His entry into the collegiate world at the University of Southern California, USC, was predicated on his physical prowess as a football player, yet even this foundation was brittle. During his junior year, a shoulder injury sustained while body surfing in the rough waves of Newport Beach became the systemic catalyst for his professional pivot. When his coach, Howard Jones, accused him of being yellow for his inability to block, the young Morrison was not just demoted to the scrubs, he was stripped of his scholarship and his sense of belonging. Forced into the prop department at Fox Film Corporation, Morrison became a laborer, a mover of things in a world of shadows. It was here that director Raoul Walsh noticed the young man's physical gait, a walk that would later become a global trademark, and rechristened him John Wayne. The name was an anomaly, he did not choose it, and he initially found it disconnected from his reality. His first lead role in The Big Trail, 1930, was a financial and technological fiasco, shot in a widescreen format that theaters during the Great Depression could not afford to project. Consequently, Wayne was relegated to poverty row studios like Republic and Monogram for a decade, grinding out low-budget westerns that he described as a monotonous cycle of repetitive labor. This period of obscurity was the furnace that forged the professional work ethic he would later use to navigate the high-stakes hegemony of Hollywood stardom. The paradox of his origin lies in the fact that the man who became the symbol of American masculinity spent his formative years trying to escape a name he considered weak and a career failure that haunted his early 20s. This fundamental tension between the prop boy Marion and the star John Wayne would define the next 50 years of his life, creating a systemic rift between his private insecurities and his public hegemony. As he navigated this internal landscape, the women in his life would become the primary witnesses to the cracks in the mirror, watching as the man struggled to live up to the titan he had become on the silver screen. The transition from the dusty streets of Glendale to the spotlight of Hollywood was not a straight line, but a jagged path marked by the debris of a discarded identity. The year 1939 serves as the definitive pivot in the architecture of the Wayne legend, a moment where the Poverty Row actor was systematically dismantled and rebuilt into a global hegemon. After a decade of making repetitive, low-budget westerns, Wayne was cast by his mentor and big brother figure John Ford in Stagecoach. The entrance of the Ringo Kid, a tracking shot focusing on Wayne spinning a Winchester, not only transformed him into an overnight sensation, but established the visual grammar of the American hero. This cinematic moment was the catalyst for a fundamental shift in the American consciousness, as Wayne began to embody a politics of gender and patriot identity that transcended his actual history. However, the reality of this starting was fraught with a brutal, systemic hierarchy. John Ford, despite being the architect of Wayne's success, treated him with a nasty streak that bordered on the sadistic. Ford frequently mocked Wayne's lack of military service and his phony tough guy image, even during the production of classics like The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. This relationship was a profound anomaly in Hollywood, a a dominant patriarchal director who simultaneously created and humiliated his greatest star. As explained by Gary Wills in John Wayne's America, Wayne became an unself-conscious man who was acutely aware of his own image, a paradoxical state of being where every gesture was calculated to fit a myth that he himself was still learning to inhabit. During the 1940s, Wayne's career trajectory became an unstoppable force of nature. He moved from the individualist cowboy in Stagecoach to the authoritative military figure in Sands of Iwo Jima, 1949. This shift was not merely a career move, it was a political manufacture. He began to embody a politics of gender, male, ideology, patriot, and character, self-reliant, that spoke to the needs of a nation navigating the complexities of post-war global power. He became the model of the American soldier, a role that would soon clash with a reality he could not escape. While the world saw him winning World War II on the silver screen, the actual battlefield was a place he had never set foot on during the conflict. The paradox lies in the fact that as Wayne's on-screen power grew, his personal autonomy was often undermined by the studio system and the complex relationships he maintained with his directors. He was a canny careerist who was acutely aware of his gifts and image, yet he regularly played men who appeared unself-conscious and uninterested in their own legends. This duality created a systemic tension that permeated his domestic life. His wives and children were often left to reconcile the quiet, sensitive man who collected Native American Kachina dolls with the rugged, immovable force that the public demanded him to be. The blueprint of the Titan was complete, but the foundations were under constant pressure from the weight of the myth. To comprehend the sheer scale of John Wayne's influence, one must look beyond the box office and into the systemic frontier myth that anchors the American psyche. As explained by Richard Slotkin in his seminal work, Gunfighter Nation, The Myth of the Frontier in 20th Century America, the frontier experience is the oldest and most significant symbolic expression of the nation's history. Slotkin argues that this phenomenon, known as the myth of the frontier, provides the language and structural devices for Americans to navigate ideological stress. John Wayne became the living embodiment of this theory, the archetypal figure of the violent adventurer who brings order to the wilderness through regeneration through violence. Wayne's persona provided a sense of continuity and moral justification for American expansionism, from the Rough Riders to the counterinsurgency missions in Southeast Asia. His image was not a static artifact, but a dynamic tool of cultural hegemony. He spoke to the needs of his audience at crucial periods in history, becoming a biography of an idea rather than just a man. Americans invested their deepest emotions in this embodiment of their myths, entangled in his story as a means of defining what it meant to be American. This academic anchor is the core of his credibility. He was the vessel through which the racialist theories of Anglo-Saxon superiority, pioneered by Theodore Roosevelt, were filtered into the popular consciousness. However, this mythic structure was inherently exclusionist, idealizing the white male adventurer as the sole hero of national history. The irony lies in the fact that while Wayne represented the self-reliant man, his own life was deeply entangled with institutional power, from the Hollywood studios that managed his image to the political figures who utilized his star power for propaganda purposes. His patriotism was a lifelong effort to atone for his lack of service, a systemic drive to solidify the mirage into fact. As Slotkin notes, mythic formulations are subject to tests of validity, and Wayne's life was a perpetual trial of his own legend. The consequence of this gunfighter's gospel was a national identity that frequently blurred the lines between cinematic fantasy and geopolitical reality. Gary Wills hypothesizes that America's fantasies about a movie star like Wayne contributed to the nation's entry into the Vietnam War, as leaders and citizens alike attempted to kick butt in the same way they had seen the Duke do on screen. The new frontier of the 1960s, invoked by John F. Kennedy, tapped into this latent ideological power, using Wayne as the uncredited blueprint for a heroic political scenario. The anchor was deep, but it held the nation fast to a version of itself that was increasingly at odds with a polyglot, multicultural reality. The deepest shadow in the Wayne architecture, and the most striking paradox of his career, is his absence from the battlefields of World War II. While contemporaries like Jimmy Stewart enlisted and flew combat missions, and Henry Fonda served in the Navy, John Wayne remained in Hollywood, crafting a mirage of military valor that he never personally experienced. This anomaly remains the root cause of the systemic guilt that haunted his later life and fueled his hyper-patriotic politics. Initially, Wayne received a 3A deferment in 1941, citing family dependency as the sole provider for his wife, Josephine Saenz, and their 4 children. However, as the war progressed and the military reclassified him as 1A, fit for duty, the Hollywood studio system intervened on his behalf. Republic Pictures, fearing the loss of their most bankable star, argued that Wayne's on-screen presence was essential for national morale and wartime propaganda. Consequently, he was granted a special 2A occupational status, a deferment in support of national interest. This decision led to a lifelong, nasty streak of criticism from combat veterans. During his USO tours in Australia and the Pacific Islands in 1942 and 1943, he was frequently booed by troops who recognized the dissonance between the man on the stage and the hero on the screen. His third wife, Pilar Wayne, noted that he became a super-patriot, specifically to atone for staying home while his peers fought. Adding to this complex layer is the Dietrich anomaly. In his book, American Titan, Mark Elliott suggests that Wayne's intense, off-screen intimate liaison with actress Marlene Dietrich was a significant factor in his reluctance to serve. While Dietrich herself would eventually go to the front lines to entertain troops, Wayne remained in Hollywood, allegedly paralyzed by the fear that his late-blooming stardom would evaporate if he were out of the public eye for too long. This systemic conflict between his personal desires and his public mythos created a fundamental fracture in his image that he spent the rest of his life trying to repair through roles like Sergeant Stryker and the production of the Green Berets. The paradox lies in the fact that the man who was booed by soldiers in 1942 would eventually be awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom posthumously in 1980 for his enduring influence on the perception of the American fighting man. This transformation from draft dodger to national icon was a miracle of image management and a testament to the power of the cinematic mirage. Yet in his private moments, as recounted by those who knew him best, the shadow of the unworn uniform was a ghost that never truly vanished, a systemic reminder of the gap between the myth and the man. John Wayne's economic architecture was a mirage of wealth that frequently collapsed into systemic ruin, a reality that lay hidden beneath the surface of his blockbuster success. For nearly 2 decades, his finances were managed by Beau Ruse, a business manager who allegedly lost 2 fortunes of Wayne's money through negligence and ill-advised investments. This financial vulnerability was the primary catalyst for Wayne's departure from Republic Pictures in 1952 to form Batjack Productions, originally Wayne Fellows Productions. He was not just seeking artistic control, he was fighting for financial survival, attempting to rebuild a fortune that had been systematically drained by the man he trusted. The ultimate manifestation of this struggle was The Alamo, 1960, a film that became Wayne's personal and financial Alamo. He had pursued the project for 15 years, only to find that major studios were unwilling to fund a historical epic where all the heroes die at the end. Finally, Wayne mortgaged his own house, his production company, and his future earnings to raise the staggering $12 million budget, the costliest film ever made on American soil at that time. He famously stated, "Every last damn dime I have in the world, I tied up in this thing." The systemic pressure of the production was so immense that he smoked 100 cigarettes a day and was forced into a predatory distribution deal with United Artists just to finish the film.
The aftermath of The Alamo was a mixed legacy of critical acclaim and financial depletion. While the film was a moderate box office success and earned multiple Academy Award nominations, the unfavorable financial arrangement meant that Wayne saw little of the profit for years. The Batjack records, now housed at USC, consist of over 59 linear feet of personnel files and tax information, documenting a man who was as much a bureaucrat and risk-taker as he was an actor. He was trapped in a cycle of needing to work to pay off the debts of his own ambitions, a systemic reality that dictated his grueling filming schedule well into his 70s. The irony of The Alamo Mirage is that while the film was intended to be a monument to American folklore, it nearly destroyed the man who created it. The house of adobe he built in Brackettville, Texas, became a tourist attraction. But for Wayne, it was a reminder of a period where the flow of money was a constant source of anxiety. This financial instability was the dark undercurrent of his domestic life, as he worked relentlessly to provide for a family of 7 children, while his health began to fail under the weight of the stress. In the master suite of his Newport and Encino homes, the stoic Duke was often a man in the midst of a tempest, a domestic anomaly that stood in stark contrast to his on-screen invulnerability. His second marriage to Esperanza Chata Bauer was a union characterized by intemperate outbursts and systemic jealousy. The most shocking incident occurred after a late night of filming. A distrustful and intoxicated Chata allegedly fired a .45 handgun at Wayne as he attempted to enter their locked home through a window. During their subsequent divorce trial, accusations surfaced of infidelity and rough interactions, casting a long shadow over Wayne's moral integrity in the public eye. His
His third marriage to Pilar Payete lasted 25 years, but was eventually strained by his relentless work ethic and the nasty streak that could emerge when he was under pressure. Pilar's memoir, John Wayne, My Life with the Duke, reveals a man who could be a loving portrait of strength one moment and a stormy presence the next. She recounts a marathon 3-day bender where Wayne and actor Rod Taylor did nothing but talk and drink while the family's activities swirled around them in a domestic vacuum. This cycle of exhaustion and intensity was typical for a man who needed to know everything about someone immediately when he met them, yet often kept his own vulnerabilities locked behind a wall of silence.
Asa Wayne's account in John Wayne, My Father paints a softer yet equally complex picture of a man who was a stern, firm, and kind father, but lived in constant fear of failure. He was a man who worked hard and played just about his heart, often bringing his children to remote movie sets like the Alamo, where they were given minor roles to keep the family together. The paradox of his domesticity was that the man who championed traditional family values on screen often left his wives to navigate the complexities of raising children alone, while he pursued the Alamo mirage or another paycheck. The domestic friction was the systemic price of the myth. To be John Wayne for the world, he often had to be absent for those who actually knew him as Marion. His wives were not just companions, they were the navigators of a man who was perpetually at war with his own image. As Pilar notes, his separation in his dying years was blamed on a work ethic that became a barrier between him and the people he loved most. The tempest in the suite was the natural result of a man who had built a life on a foundation of professional responsibility, but lacked the architecture for emotional peace.
For John Wayne, the ultimate sanctuary was not a ranch in Arizona, but the Wild Goose, a 136-foot converted World War II minesweeper. Purchased in 1962 for $116,000, the ship became the floating fortress, where the Wayne hegemony could exist without the prying eyes of the Hollywood system. Because Wayne stood 6'4", he commissioned a major systemic remodel in 1965 to raise most of the ship's ceilings by 8 inches, an architectural adjustment that allowed the Titan to stand tall in his own home. The ship was a sensory masterpiece of mahogany, card rooms, and priceless paintings, where the smell of salt air mingled with the aroma of his 100 cigarette-a-day habit. The Wild Goose featured 5 staterooms, which Wayne named after the movies he starred in, a systemic reinforcement of his own legend. Guests like Dean Martin stayed in the Red Witch Room, while Sammy Davis Jr. occupied the Poseidon stateroom. One of the most unique features was a walk-in freezer in the galley, installed so Wayne could bring back actual glacier ice from his trips to Alaska for use in his evening cocktails. The fireplace room served as the ship's social hub, where he screened his own movies and played poker with the Rat Pack at a custom-built round table. Even here, the paradox remained. The boat he loved most had started its life as a naval vessel, a systemic link to the military world he had avoided during his youth.
In Newport Beach, his waterfront home on Bayshore Drive was unpretentious by Hollywood standards, but filled with a collection of curios and mementos, Native American kachina dolls, Western art, and shells that had no rhyme or reason other than they appealed to him. He preferred this crash pad because it offered a front-row seat to the bay and immediate access to his yacht. This was the architecture of his final decade, a man who had conquered the frontier of the screen and now sought only the quiet hegemony of the harbor. The Wild Goose was not just a luxury item, it was a home away from home where Wayne could finally be a family man without the shadow of the unworn uniform looming over him. Yet even in this sanctuary, the systemic pressures of his career followed him. He lived on the yacht for 2 months while recuperating from surgery, using the sea air as a catalyst for his recovery. The floating fortress was his last great stand, a place where the mirage and the man could finally exist in the same space, buffered by the waves and the mahogany wood.
The final performance of John Wayne was his decade-long battle with cancer, a disease he referred to as the Big C, with a stoicism that matched his screen persona. The systemic decay began in 1964 with the removal of his left lung and several ribs, yet he was back on set filming The Sons of Katie Elder just 14 weeks later, an anomaly of physical willpower. His work ethic, while a catalyst for his survival, also served to mask the mounting toll on his body. He made his last movie, The Shootist, in 1976, playing a man dying of cancer, a cinematic mirroring of his reality that many found hauntingly prophetic. His final public appearance at the 1979 Academy Awards was a moment of sheer determination. Looking frail but standing tall, he received a standing ovation that served as a final synthesis of his life and myth. He died on June 11, 1979. And as Aida held his hand, he gave his final assurance. "Of course, I know who you are. You're my girl. I love you." This human moment was the ultimate dismantling of the Duke hegemony, revealing the vulnerable father beneath the armor of the star. He was buried in an unmarked grave at Pacific View Memorial Park in Newport Beach, a final act of privacy for a man whose life had been entirely public.
The legacy he left behind was a reservoir of anecdotes and a profound influence on the American perception of manhood. His son, Michael Wayne, would spend the next 2 decades meticulously managing the Batjack archives and the release pattern of his father's films, ensuring that the John Wayne myth remained a profitable and pristine hegemony. The man who was once teased for being Marion had successfully manufactured a version of himself that was immortal, yet the cost of that immortality was a life spent navigating the turbulence of a manufactured reality.
The architecture of John Wayne was a mirage designed to withstand the scrutiny of history, a fundamental pillar of American identity built on the unstable sands of Marion Morrison's insecurities. He was a draft dodger who became the ultimate soldier, a bankrupt dreamer who built a production empire, and a stern father who remained a child in search of validation. John Wayne was not just an actor, he was a systemic necessity, a catalyst for a nation that needed a hero who could spin a Winchester without flinching. Does the reality of the prop boy from Glendale diminish the myth of the Duke, or does the struggle to maintain that mirage make him more humanly tragic? As he lies in an unmarked grave, the question remains, was he the man who shot Liberty Valance, or was he simply the man who was lucky enough to be cast in the role? His life was a paradox, and his death was a transition from history to myth, leaving behind a haunting statement: we are all, in some way, prisoners of the identities we manufacture for the world.